December 2nd, 1971. A Soviet spacecraft becomes the first machine in human history to survive a landing on Mars. It opens its cameras. It begins transmitting. 14.5 seconds later, it goes silent forever, having sent back exactly one image, a blank, grey, featureless frame. Over 50 years later, nobody knows for certain what killed it. That's not the only silent space exploration has never fully explained. In 2003, a British lander vanished completely on Christmas Day, triggering an 11-year mystery that ended in one of the strangest anticlimaxes in space history. And decades before either of those missions, a Cold War legend has persisted that the Soviets lost cosmonauts in space, real human beings, and erased them from history before the world ever knew their names. Two of these stories are documented fact. One of them might be the biggest myth in the history of the space race. A myth perhaps with good reason. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly which is which, and why even the solved cases still leave you with more questions than answers. Case 1. Mars 3, USSR, 1971. In 1971, the Soviet Union launched twin spacecraft toward Mars, Mars 2 and Mars 3, each carrying an orbiter and a lander, racing to beat NASA to the surface by 5 years. Mars 2's lander crashed. But on December 2nd, Mars 3 achieved something no human-made object ever had: a soft, successful landing on another planet. The lander's petals opened, its cameras activated. It began transmitting its first image back through the orbiter toward Earth. But there was a problem waiting for it. Weeks earlier, NASA's Mariner 9 orbiter had already discovered something alarming. Mars was in the grip of the largest dust storm ever observed, a swirling shroud engulfing the entire planet. Mars 3 descended straight into it. Therefore, at exactly 14.5 seconds into transmission, on both of its data channels simultaneously, the signal cut out. Forever. All that reached Earth was a single grey frame. No horizon, no rocks, no detail. Nothing. For decades, that was it. The most successful first contact moment in Soviet space history reduced to a blank photograph, and a mystery nobody could solve, because there simply wasn't enough data to work with. Was it the dust storm generating an electrical discharge that fried the electronics? A communications failure on the orbiter relaying the signal? Nobody has ever been able to say for certain. The fault could have originated in the lander itself, or in the orbiter passing overhead. In 2013, Russian space enthusiasts' crowdsourcing analysis of NASA orbital photographs identified something that might be Mars 3's parachute, sitting exactly where the numbers said it should be. A tantalizing confirmation that the landing itself really happened. But confirming where it landed isn't the same as confirming why it died. Over half a century later, the actual cause of that 14.5-second silence remains officially unknown. Case 2. Beagle 2, UK, 2003. Now, a mystery that started identically and ended completely differently after over a decade of nothing at all. On Christmas Day, 2003, Britain's Beagle 2 lander was set to touch down on Mars, its scientists waiting anxiously back home for a signal. It never came. Not that day, not the next, not ever. Every attempt to reach it, from multiple spacecraft, from radio telescopes on Earth, returned silence. The mission's lead scientist, Colin Pillinger, spent the next decade searching for answers, refusing to fully accept that his lander was simply gone. He died in May 2014, without ever learning what actually happened to Beagle 2. But 8 months later, in January 2015, NASA's Mars Reconnaissance Orbiter finally spotted it, sitting intact, on the surface. Not a crash site at all. Here's what made this discovery so strange. The heat shield had worked. The parachutes had deployed. The airbags had cushioned the landing exactly as designed. Beagle 2 had done almost everything right, landing within about 5 kilometers of its target, a genuine engineering triumph. Its downfall was almost absurdly small. The lander was built like a mechanical flower, with 4 solar panels meant to unfold in sequence, revealing its antenna underneath the final petal. Photographs showed that only 2 or 3 of those 4 panels had actually opened. 1 stuck panel. That's all it took. The lander had survived a 300 million-mile journey and one of the most dangerous descents in spaceflight, only to be silenced by a single motor, or a single hinge, that never quite finished its job, permanently trapping the very antenna it needed to say, "I made it." Beagle 2 wasn't a failure. It was a near-total success that lost by an inch. And it took 11 years just to learn that much. Case 3. The Lost Cosmonauts, USSR, alleged pre-1961. And now, the story that isn't really about a machine at all. Officially, Yuri Gagarin became the first human in space on April 12, 1961. But for over 60 years, a persistent legend has claimed that wasn't entirely true, that the Soviets tried and failed before Gagarin ever left the ground, and buried the evidence. At the center of this legend are 2 Italian brothers, Achille and Giovanni Giudica Cordiglia, amateur radio operators who built a listening station inside an old World War II bunker outside Turin. Starting in 1960, they claimed to intercept a series of chilling transmissions, a faint SOS in Morse code, labored human breathing, and, most hauntingly, a recording said to capture a female cosmonaut's final words as her capsule burned up on re-entry, crying out that conditions were growing worse. Alongside these recordings grew another rumor, centered on a real Soviet test pilot named Vladimir Ilyushin, one of the most skilled aviators in the country. The theory claimed Ilyushin had actually reached orbit days before Gagarin suffered a catastrophic malfunction and crash-landed injured in China, where he was secretly held for a year while the Soviets covered up the entire mission. Space historians, however, who've spent decades combing through declassified Soviet archives, including American journalist James Oberg, who researched Soviet space disasters extensively in the 1980s, have found no evidence any of this actually happened. The Giudica Cordiglia recordings have been heavily criticized by experts. The alleged cosmonauts don't use standard radio protocol, several voices don't even sound like native Russian speakers, and no genuine Soviet mission has ever been matched to any of the recorded dates. As for Vladimir Ilyushin, the man himself lived until 2010, and never once, in his entire life, claimed to have flown to space before Gagarin. Editors of Soviet space history archives have stated plainly that his name simply isn't on the list of cosmonauts who trained, flew, or died in that program. So why has this legend survived for over 60 years? Because the 2 real cases you just watched gave it exactly the soil it needed to grow. We know for a fact that the Soviet space program hid failures. Mars 3's own dust storm death was barely announced at the time. We know Cold War secrecy was real, and that governments on both sides buried embarrassing mission failures for decades. Once you know a government is capable of silence, it becomes remarkably easy to believe there's more silence hiding underneath it. Now put all 3 of these cases side by side, and something interesting happens. Mars 3 is a real, unresolved mystery, 14.5 seconds of data, and 50 years of educated guessing, because there simply wasn't enough evidence left behind to know for certain. Beagle 2 is a solved mystery, 11 years of nothing, ended by a single photograph that turned an assumed catastrophe into a story about one stubborn, unopened solar panel. And the Lost Cosmonauts are neither. They're what happens when real secrecy, real silence, and real Cold War distrust get combined with recordings nobody has ever been able to verify, until a legend becomes almost impossible to fully kill, even after historians have shown again and again that the evidence simply isn't there. Maybe that's the real lesson connecting all three. Silence from space doesn't always mean something sinister happened. Sometimes it means a dust storm. Sometimes it means one motor on one solar panel quietly failing to finish its job. And sometimes the silence was never really coming from space at all. It was coming from an old bunker outside Turin, filled with static, and our own willingness to believe the worst was hiding inside it. If mysteries like this, the real, the solved, and the almost certainly not real, keep you coming back, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what cases you'd like to see next.